Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this session. I know that a large part of the Racina dialogue is networking, but please may I request that you keep your conversations to a minimum so that you can also enjoy the conversation that we're going to have. I would like to introduce my distinguished panel before I introduce the topic that we're going to talk about. To my right is Narek Mkrtchyan, who is a minister in Armenia of labor and social issues. He will be speaking first this evening because he has a flight at 10 o'clock, so very inconveniently he will not be here for the Q&A session, but he will grace us with his opening remarks in a few minutes. The rest of my panel here is Shrayana Bhattacharya, who is an economist for social protection and labor unit at the World Bank. Then we have Singh, who is the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission in India. We have Athira Menon, who is the head of public policy for Uber in India and South Asia. And last but not least, we have Heungchong, who is the president of the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy in Korea. So obviously this is a very topical and interesting discussion that we're going to have. It's been introduced as a question of privacy versus rights in terms of data and identity, in terms of regulatory frameworks, and in terms of social security and bargaining. But fundamentally, what this does boil down to is the fundamental imperative to promote and protect the rights of workers while balancing the ability to allow innovation to thrive. So let me turn first to Narek. Narek, you mentioned in the conversation earlier that a lot of the issues that Armenia is facing in part seem to already have answers to be found in India. Would you like to elaborate on that for us?
Thank you, dear Lucy. First of all, dear excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to speak here, to be part of the Racina dialogue. I'm the Minister of Labor and Social Affairs of Armenia with historical background. And when we take into consideration any kind of economic challenges, I always measure it through the prism of historical thinking. And we divide the historical time into three parts, like the political time, economic time, and civilizational time. And today's topic that we will discuss, it's in fact the topic of the economic time, when we will understand what kind of challenges we have in this medium period of time. You are right. Today I had a meeting with the Minister of Labor and Employment of India, and we were discussing different topics, and one of the topic is the gig economy and informal working, the status of the informal workers, how to institutionalize it, how to formalize it, how to use the digital transformation age, the challenges to turn into opportunities. And it was a surprise for me that most of the challenges that we have in Armenia, and we shared the patterns, it's already existed in India, and now they found different interesting solutions to them, and we agreed to form working group to work on it. So the disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, different so ICT technologies in fact they are triggered by fourth revolution, geographical shift, environmental changes, create different challenges and opportunities simultaneously. And the application of that technologies to different and each phase of the labor production, in fact, in our country, in many countries of the world, I think it creates challenges both for the labor arrangements and system, and also social security protection system. And the most challenge for us is to understand how to include these informal workers into the social security processes. And the interesting phenomenon, when we take this into consideration to the prism of social and psychological thinking, what is there is a phenomenon that we should take into consideration, that the initial essence of the social contract is under the question. If the social contract is under question, then one of the fundamental bases of state is under the question. So then there is another issue, the social dialogue. That's why this is important. The formalization of such kind of informality is important for the social dialogue. And these ongoing transformations by the fourth revolution changes the form of employment, but also it creates opportunities. And sometimes we say that these technological transformations will trigger to destroy different professions, but it also can create other professions as well. For example, recently during one of the ministerial committees in our government, we are discussing about the subjects, about the courses in universities. For example, the profession of accountant or the profession of auditors. So we don't want the young people to waste, for example, 4-6 years from their lifetime and to learn that profession, because AI technologies, AI tools come to replace that technologies, and we say that we can, for example, provide you another vision. But it doesn't mean that the physical engagement of people will not have a place, because still technological innovation needs physical intervention, like to label, design data. So the data management is still needs people. So during the pandemic, the first time we faced with the challenges of the distance work, and which is similar to the gig economy, and we understand that we have to do a lot of in order to formalize it, because sometimes technological changes are faced faster than the governments that do take decision to adopt their national legislation, because this is also a challenge for the legal scholars, for the, in fact, governmental legislator to understand how to formalize what kind of legal frameworks to form in order to engage informalities, which in fact they are in a state of legal limbo in relation to their legal status. And the task of the government is to control uncertainties. So what are the solutions? Now we are, so besides the theoretical thinking, taking into consideration the practical executive part, now we are thinking in the government to do different measures in order to solve this problem. And we think that one of the solutions is the self-declaration system and collecting, which will provide us to collect relevant information. So each individual who work for example, gig economy companies, they declare their incomes, and the government see what kind of incomes they have. And for this purpose, we propose that we can develop like electronic and mobile registration and payment systems, adopt more simplified tax and contribution collection mechanism, and use the benefits of emerging technologies such as I already mentioned, artificial intelligence. Next, it is very important to like make platform systems understand that they have social responsibility. They should take responsibility and also to participate in the social dialogue, because this is very important with the social contract, hence the social dialogue is under danger. Another important part is that we know that these gig economy companies, they are usually international, and they are registering in that country where the tax rates are lower. So we have to have mechanism to include them into social protection system that would work in cross-border, in fact, arrangements to make platform companies declare their profits where tax rates in order they are registering their companies, but also to contribute to that countries where they are registered. And finally, I want to stress out the role of the trade unions. So they also should, trade unions and workers' organizations, to emit more bargaining power and probably more functions. So they should take active role in these processes. After which the governments should, in fact, do their best to provide decent conditions for the workers for all the bases in order to provide in fact sustainable inclusive development. I think I tried to put it more short and comprehensive. This is the problem that we face, challenge that we face, and today that we met with the Minister of Labor and Social Affairs of Labor and Employment of India, Minister. So we decided to form a working group and to share best practices because the patterns are the same, problems are the same, and I think that such kind of challenges are the same for different countries. It doesn't matter the size, the GDP size, the population size, the physical size of the country, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, very much for that all-encompassing overview of some of the challenges that we need to address, and we wish you bon voyage. I want to pick up on something that the Minister raised in terms of the obligations of cross-border platforms. It brings to mind a wonderful quote by the Keynesian economist Joan Robinson, who said in 1962, and it still holds true today, the misery of being exploited by capitalists, which we could now replace with multinational companies and now platforms, is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. I think that some of my colleagues in the Global South can identify with that. As a South African, I definitely do. I would like to turn now to Shrayana. How do we, given that many of the more powerful actors that we are dealing with are multinational companies with the added complexity of being platforms, which in many cases don't actually fit into the current international legislation that we have, how do we look to instill appropriate protections while balancing the right to innovate in a more global context?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Firstly, to the quote that you just mentioned, there's also the other quote, which is, and I'm sort of drawing on Joan Robinson's work, where she basically says the idea is a job is not just an instrument to economic growth. A job is a sense of meaning. It's a sense of purpose. It's a sense of identity. I think we are seeing shifts in the global compact around what jobs people are just not willing to do, and the kinds of jobs that migrants also have to take on. So I just want to sort of foreground what I'm about to say with the fact that we need to think about the labor market not just as a set of transactions, but also a set of meanings that are constantly being negotiated. And I think that's important. I think to answer your question, a lot of what I'm about to say draws on work that the World Bank, the ILO, the IMF as well, they've been thinking through on what could a future global social protection system look like, right? And I think that it has to contend with that really difficult question you asked, which is if you have platforms, and I think the Honorable Minister also mentioned, which defy in many cases national legislation, and there is no global legislation which they can adhere to, what does that mean? I think the first thing, actually, the answer starts with the national. And if you look at what different countries are thinking and contending to do, what you need is a labor market that feels assured. If you look at the work of, say, people like Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, a lot of experiments by economists seem to suggest that if workers feel psychologically assured, they take on more risk, they diversify their livelihood portfolio. I think those questions of innovation start to come in as well. And currently we do have labor markets, particularly in the global south, given the high rates of informality, limited access to social insurance, you have a labor force that is essentially very precarious psychologically as well. And I think one of the solutions to that is to think through, could it be a quasi-universal basic income? Could it be some form of a platform which assures a core basket of support? India is moving in that direction, as are many other countries which are thinking of combining, say, a right to work. I mean, you think of a program like Narek, which is very large in India and has really worked during the pandemic, marrying that with social insurance programs, some guarantees as well. And I think different countries will come at that very differently. But I think the first step has to be national assurance mechanisms through a social protection system that works for all workers, and particularly handles three fluidities now, I think, that are just emerging in the labor market. One is you are going to have a more mobile labor market, and it's not just the case of international migration, but even nationally. We saw this in India during the pandemic. You had migrants moving, and you do have new programs coming in to try and support migrant workers, but thinking through how do you allow for the portability of a social protection system, that's going to be absolutely critical moving forward. The second is energy transitions. Lots of jobs are in flux. You will see big dramatic shifts in the labor market, particularly as countries start to meet carbon commitments, different kinds of goals related to the environment. And I don't know yet if lots of countries, and I think this is something that is being discussed, how do you ensure that a social protection system is dynamic enough where if you see certain sectors that are being affected, you can immediately provide support and then graduate out as opposed to just constantly providing support. So thinking of mechanisms that are portable, adaptive and dynamic, can respond quickly, and technology plays a huge role, but I think it's more a question of policy and setting that out very clearly. And the third, I think, is looking at, we are now in a world of shocks. The pandemic, we still don't know what the direction of that will be. We are now at a stage where it could be there'll be additional waves. There might be communities of workers who are particularly affected, not just because of the pandemic, other natural kinds of shocks. You could have disasters. In India, we have states in the eastern coast where are constantly affected and dealing with cyclones, and the labor force is dealing with these issues as well. And so again, I think it requires a cohesive social protection system which tackles climate, tackles questions of energy transitions, and provides core assurance mechanisms. It could be cash, it could be in kind. I think different governments will come at that very differently. And once you have that in place through platforms, and right now we have the technology to do it. India, in fact, is, and I want to just double down on what I think the Honorable Minister said about there's a lot to learn from India, particularly looking at the use of technology in creating some of these platforms. And I think India actually could learn a lot from other countries, and I'm particularly thinking of, say, a Brazil or a Mexico, on how do you create policy environments such that there are these dynamic adaptive systems that are set up through social registries, perhaps. So I think the answer, strangely, to an almost global problem, first is to let's have national systems that are portable, adaptive and dynamic, respond to workers, and don't entrench workers in the welfare path, but you can have graduation strategies in and out, and have to deal with energy transitions and climate, because these are the big shifts. If you don't create a political constituency through these kinds of mechanisms nationally, thinking of global cooperation to deal with some of these really hard issues is going to be very difficult. So I think the answer has to be first very clear national programs that are portable, dynamic, and climate responsive.
Thank you very much. So, does this work? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I think maybe just to pick up a point there, you were talking about the importance of national systems specifically in the absence of an international network. I think in that case, we should definitely turn to our host country, India, in terms of the Code on Social Security that was promulgated in 2020. Honorable N.K. Singh, can you perhaps talk to us a little bit more about that, just in terms of what the implications of this is, the potential challenges to implementation, and especially the two issues that you touched on in our chat earlier, what this means for the formalization of the very large informal labor force that we find in many countries, including India, and the impact on migratory labor and migration, because these are all interlinked.
Well, it's on. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lucy, for those questions. And the Honourable Minister has perhaps had to leave, but I found great merit in a number of points which he made. And some of it has a global application. Some of it is more country-specific. And I agree with Shrayana's comments on many of the sort of complexities in this process. As far as I can see, as a country like India is concerned, there are 5 important challenges. First and foremost is to understand the somewhat unique characteristics of the Indian market. Very few markets would have 80% or higher than 80% of their entire workforce in the informal sector. So the formalization of this 80%, which constitutes a very high percentage of GDP and which constitutes a very high percentage of the total labor force, is a somewhat unique challenge that faces India. Second, I think when it comes to technology, the important issue is that the technology transition to a 4G era, which enables you assured broadband connectivity, is an ongoing challenge as we upgrade our system. So before we begin to look at what technology can do for us, we have to ensure the access, assured access to technology in the 575,000 village panchayats and some local configuration. A lot of work has been done, but this is an ongoing challenge, and we should meet this target in the course of the next year or so. And I think that that would enable a lot of changes. Third, I agree with the comments made, Shrayana, that certain very decisive initiatives were taken by the government during the COVID. And I must mention that 4 important changes towards the formalization of the Indian economy. First, I don't know if you focused ever on one important slogan which captivated everyone, that for a country of this size, one country, one ration card. Now, if you have a country of 1.3 billion people, to have one common ration card which cuts across boundaries, administrative frontiers between migrant, non-migrant workers was an important challenge. That, coupled with the strengthening of the food distribution system, free food, that coupled with strengthening the financial status of the employment guarantee scheme, made a qualitative difference in the direct delivery, using technology for purposes of being able not only to formalize, but to ensure that the burden of the ongoing pandemic was mitigated, particularly to large segments of the rural economy. The third important challenge is to perceive some of the areas which you mentioned, Shrayana, and I agree with you, that you look at 3 important patterns of Indian activity. One, agriculture. In agriculture, what the new technology has to offer, changes in agricultural practices, changes in the nature of the chemicals and fertilizers to be used, changes in the patterns of dependence and marketing, and in terms of agricultural practice, which optimizes the gains of productivity, where there is a unique chemistry and blend between higher productivity and between higher incomes. 2 more and I'll stop. The use of this technology and reach for strengthening the India's health infrastructure, which by the way is not one of our strongest points, because our health infrastructure, we all know, needs a lot of fundamental changes, but technology did provide telemedicine and did provide particularly large, poor, populous states the reach to be able to gain from the kind of facilities which the technology has to offer. Equally, and that's finally, in terms of pedagogy, education, and education systems. One of the things which we read about is the inequalities which the COVID led to. One important area of inequality was the consequences in learning, in pedagogy, and imparting education. Because not everyone could avail of the benefits of really the online teaching methods. So the fundamental change which it brought about, and that can be deepened on a hybrid mixture as we begin to balance a pedagogy which enables multiple jobs in a lifetime, which enables informality, which enables exactly something which you said, that the status of people changing from formal to informal. And finally, before I close, one of the biggest challenge which we faced, Lucy, was that we have a huge migrant population. And that when the lockdown took place on account of COVID, we had these ghastly images of people leaving cities, leaving urban conglomerates, and joining the large, disorganized, informal economy of the rural economy. We met this challenge by exactly some of the things which we did strengthening the food distribution system, enabling the benefits of improved online, improving the reach in terms of health facilities, and a constellation of all these factors. So when we talk of the paradigms which emerge, no one fixed paradigm is good enough. The classic case of one size doesn't fit all. And I think that India would fall in that unique category. Thank you very much, Lucy, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. There's been a decided policy and public sector slant to the comments thus far. So I'm going to now turn to Athira, who joins us from Uber, to give us a flavor from the private sector. Obviously, Athira, you represent a very well-known platform. And given how important platforms have become in terms of a source of employment, that infers an increasing responsibility for the workforce that forms part of your business model and who ultimately supports your success. What is your outlook for sustainable labor policy and practices from the perspective of a platform that participates in an economy like this one?
Thank you, Lucy, for the question, and thank you for moderating this panel. See, in the last decade, the digital marketplace and platforms like Uber has been able to create a new type of work where people can choose where to work, what work they want to do, and what income they want to earn. And it has also given a new option for people who were otherwise traditionally marginalized from the labor force. So while the digital marketplace and platforms have created millions of economic opportunities across the globe, it is important that we acknowledge and accept that there should be social security measures that should be taken where both companies, platforms, as well as government need to work together to come up with these. If nothing, the current health crisis that we are facing has brought sharp focus to how, irrespective of the employment status, it is important that people enjoy social protection, social security benefits. And which is why we laud the efforts of Indian government for having come up with the Code on Social Security in 2020, where probably, if I'm not mistaken, it would be first in the world where a government has recognized gig workers and has also listed down the social security benefits that the gig workers should have access to. In fact, the Code on Social Security in India has also has also mentioned that the platform companies should be contributing a percentage of their yearly revenue to ensure that there is a social security fund which the gig workers have access to, and they can access their health insurance, life insurance, accidental insurance, the maternity benefits, old age pension, disability pension, etc. So we believe that it's a commendable effort from the Indian policymakers to have come up with it. And it is very important that platforms like us create awareness and educate the driver partners or with respect to Uber, the driver community, on what are the benefits that the government is providing and how they can access. So, for example, couple of years back, we worked with National Health Authority to partner with the government on Ayushman Bharat scheme, where eligible driver partners from our community could have access to the health insurance scheme, which covers them and their family for over 5 lakhs. A lot of driver partners from Uber were benefited with this particular partnership. Even during COVID, a lot of driver partners did share the feedback that this particular partnership really helped me even understand that the scheme existed and then actually have access towards it. So to answer your question, I think it is very important that platforms acknowledge that it is important that social protection is there, and that platforms and government have to work to ensure that it reaches the worker. The world has changed, and it is important we also change. We have to change. We have to change for the better, because if we don't have the earners, there is no platform. So we have to acknowledge the contribution that the earners are providing to platform and work to ensure that they have a good experience on our platform.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to our last participant on this panel, Mr. Kim Heungchong. So in South Korea, gig workers represent a not insignificant proportion of the workforce. According to an official report I saw, about 8.5%. what does this mean in terms of affecting economic policy considerations in Korea? On the one hand, there is more choice, there are more flexible working hours, in some cases even better pay for the gig workers, but it does represent a fundamental shift in how we have looked at labor policy thus far, and there are potentially wide-ranging economic implications for this. Can you give us a view from Korea?
Yes. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for the inviting me in this very interesting forum. And then your questions about in Korea everything is changing very fast. And then first of all, I'd like to let you know that in terms of the general the labor market issue, about the ILO core convention issue, let me first start. And then just a week ago, the April 20th, three further core convention entry into force in Korea. So which totaled 7 out of 8 core conventions now implemented in Korea, which means that the full freedom of association is guaranteed, and also some part of the forced labors as well. And then based on this convention legislation, and also the Korea's labor market characterized by the very high level of protection for the regular workers. This is important. But the contract, as for the contract laborers, the provision is quite not so guaranteed for the laborers. And so this means that now the very recent change of the gig economy, and also platform labor workers, and then they are not fully guaranteed for the enjoying the right of the workers. And let me take one example. There is an American firm which is called Coupang. Coupang is a home delivery service, providing home delivery service. And then the CEO of the Coupang he's actually Korean. He speaks fluent Korean, but his nationality is American. It's a Korean American. And the Coupang is an American company. It's headquartered in Delaware in the United States. And the Coupang is now the market share of the Coupang in the home delivery services, something like more than 50%, very rapidly. And then, as you told, that many the workers for the Coupang, they are higher paid than the other workers, and there are big shift in the labor market from the taxi driver to the Coupang delivery services workers because of the pays well better. And then, but the problem is that there are so many the problems actually in the working conditions in the Coupang, and quite many workers actually has died actually last year and then a year before because they are identified as self-employed, and then so they do not enjoy the full scale of the workers. So now that is very important issues, as well as the another issue is that that is American company, delivery company. So there are two problems. One is the digital platform company, and the other is there's American companies who have a major business in Korea. So both of the characteristics can make a problem of not only the labor protection problem, but also national treatment and also competition policy in Korea. All is very challenging, and now the United States, the Biden administration is very, very interested in this American digital platform companies, business activities in Korea. So that is one of the problems in now between the two countries, how to solve this problem as well. And then this is also related to the WTO panel as well. So, but basically, let me say that the all workers, self-employed workers, who are in the Korean digital platform companies are not full scale, I mean, protected by the labor law because they identified the self-employed. Okay, right. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to pose a few questions to the panel now, but I want you to start thinking about your own questions that you might like to pose to this very interesting gathering of people on this topic. Athira, I'd like to first turn to you. You mentioned the importance of the responsibility of the platform and education of the workers because they contribute. The other side of that coin is the consumers. How much are you doing in terms of consumer education? Because a social safety net, which is an imperative, does not come for free. And in part, some of that responsibility will end up being carried by the consumers. So using that lens, how do you approach it from the consumer angle to ensure that there is a sustainability of business model going forward?
That's actually a very interesting question. See, it's a long road ahead for us in terms of educating our consumers about, the rights of our partners. Even the code on social security is something which the rules of which is still notified. So we are constantly engaging with the government to ensure that the rules are notified so that we can start working and creating awareness, not just with our driver community, but also with our rider community on what this entails. But it's in India, if you ask me, does our customers, by consumers if you mean the customers, are keen to know about what kind of rights that our community have, and are they basically engaging with us to understand what this is? Over the years, it has become a keen interest. A lot of customers who are using our platform reach out to us and ask about, hey, your drivers have been talking about how they've had a difficult journey during COVID. So what are the initiatives that you have been doing to ensure that they are protected? And we constantly talk to various platforms about the initiatives we have started even during COVID. For example, of course, there is financial assistance, but most importantly, one thing that we we've been putting a lot of focus on is educating both riders and our drivers on what are the existing schemes that the government have and how can you access it. And also talking to our riders about why the community guidelines that we are putting out is not just for the riders but also for drivers. We talk about why it is important that you acknowledge the struggle of the drivers and also respect them. And like you would be already knowing about the rating system on Uber platforms. So it's not just rider rating a driver, but also a driver rating a rider. And there are a lot of consumers who have been off-boarded from the platform because they have not really respected the driver community. So it's something which we really feel important to do. And we constantly take feedback from a driver community. Like, for example, we have set up recently the Driver Advisory Council, which is basically facilitated by an independent review board, which is held by Aapti Institute, where Aapti Institute has actually selected 35 drivers from across 6 cities in India. We sit with them, we understand what are their concerns, what are the kind of issues that we should be focusing on, and it's mostly a very solution-oriented discussion with the driver community. And we also try and engage with our policy stakeholders, who are also our customers, right? Like, there are a lot of policy stakeholders who take an Uber, they speak to the drivers, they try and understand what the driver concerns are, and they circle back to us saying that, hey, you know what, your drivers are struggling with these aspects, why don't you work on it? And we take those feedback very seriously, and we ensure that we work on it along with drivers to come up with solutions, and then we inform back our policy stakeholders about what are the things that we have done. So it's a constant also learning and unlearning for us. Because as companies grow, we sometimes lose sight of what is happening on ground, which is why we come back to the drawing board and ensure that we have our basics right, where both our drivers and riders understand each other's struggle, especially after COVID. It is important that we do. And it's evolving. We will never say that we have a foolproof system to do it, but we are definitely trying to be better.
Thank you very much. I want to turn now to Shrayana. A point that you mentioned in your opening remarks was about psychological safety. And I wanted to drill in on that because there's a Harvard Business Review article that I read some time ago which actually isolated psychological safety as the key issue to drive productive, efficient, innovative working in teams, regardless of the sector in which that worker is. Can you break that down for us a little bit more, particularly in the context of the gig working community that we're talking about now?
Yeah, so economists have been very interested in this idea of essentially how constant exposure to risk and constantly being, it's what someone once called the privilege of certainty, right? Which very few people have in the labor market, to know that you know where your next paycheck is coming from, you know precisely when it's coming. And if that is not the case, if that kind of enabling condition is not present, you see, in fact, so Poor Economics as a book, for example, is all about different kinds of decisions that often the poor make, precisely because they're making huge cognitive decisions under a lot of tax, right? So I think that's essentially the idea is a social protection system is not just an investment in the poor. In fact, one thing I really wanted to make, just listening to everyone here, we are no longer, in fact, in the... I was about to talk about voice, and I think we've got good voice here. Social protection is no longer about poverty. I think that's one thing. In fact, organizations working in the field have been constantly saying that, in fact, for example, if you look at a country like India or you look at Latin America, you're no longer working in a world of extreme poverty. You're working in a world of precarity. And you're also working in a world where people are constantly vulnerable to different kinds of shocks. And how do you create a mechanism? Because if you look at the current programs, which typically are called welfare programs or safety nets, they essentially target this imagination of an agrarian, rural, poor household. I think slowly and steadily you're seeing shifts, but it's gradual. The social protection system right now is not set up to deal with precarity or vulnerable workers who are moving from one job to the other. That just doesn't exist right now. And I think to create that psychological assurance, I'll again just say that you need a portable system that's dynamic. So if someone is facing a shock, they should be able, be it in Narek, the right to work that we talked about, there could be other cash transfer programs. Different countries could have different innovations when it comes to it, which is more locally tailored. But you need to have systems that respond on the spot, because otherwise we're in a world of first prove to me that you're poor, which is the traditional way it all works, and that process of just trying to prove poverty is just, there's studies and studies that show that's so difficult. The second point I actually just wanted to make was, and this picks up on I think what we were hearing about the Korean example, one of the things we actually know about informal jobs is that, in fact, there's a lot of informal collective, even if you don't have formal unions. So you take domestic workers in India, for example. India has not yet ratified the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, and it's been 10 years, it's still being discussed. And yet, if you look at domestic workers in India, and anyone who's had to try and hire someone who works in that space, they know that there are informal networks through which wages are set, practices are set up. And there's tremendous voice, in fact, in these communities of workers. And one of the things that we learn is, in fact, if you start to provide basic safety nets, workers and communities of workers will do the job of voice. You may not need to prove that you're a registered union member. There are informal networks, especially in countries like ours, where the context of network wealth is very important. Networks mediate how you access jobs. All of that is mediated through social networks. And I think in that context, I think again, and I realize I sound like a repeating record, and I've actually said this on 2 panels at the Raisina Dialogue for 2 years, and one of which I think Dr. Singh was present as well, which is that you need a platform which provides immediate support at some core level. What we have currently in different countries, not just in India, if you look at Latin America as well, you have social protection systems that are very broad, which means there are lots of programs, but the depth of the benefit is very small. And what you may want to start to do is consolidate, so you have fewer programs which are more dynamic, not just this traditional word of poverty, but to deal with precarity. And perhaps the depth of the benefit can be much larger, because that goes back to that issue of assurance as well. And questions around voice, and while, of course, we know unions and collective organizations are important, My sense is actually if you provide that assurance, a lot of the questions around voice and workers unionizing and fighting for their rights may actually be spurred and stimulated if they're not constantly juggling and trying to figure out where their next paycheck will come from. And so I just want to again emphasize the idea of a more cohesive, portable, and a social protection system that responds to the current labor force, not this imagined idea of extreme poverty, which I still think a lot of country social protection systems are imagined for. We are not in that world anymore, and I think we're still yet to move away where we de-link our social security mechanisms from the office, right? Like the workplace. And for that, you need a portable platform which governments, national governments will have to set up. And each one will look very different.
Thanks. I want to pick up again on that, the concept of uncertainty and precarity, and move to Dr. Singh. You've partly answered the question in some of your opening remarks, but given the segment of the population that we're dealing with, there's a saying that says, never waste a good crisis. What were some of the key transformations that occurred during the COVID pandemic period, of particularly the last 2 years? Who knows how many waves we have to look forward to? But in the last 2 years, what are the key changes, developments, challenges that were met, particularly in this sector, while we see the transformation of the gig economy in parallel?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I must say that one of the really transformative change, and I'll come to that in a minute, I just wanted to emphasize that I should have said that people look at India as a large country with over 1.3 billion people, with perhaps not as much of a geographical area commensurate with that population, so the pressure of population on land is very high. But we must remember that India is a union of states. It is not a confederation of states. It's not a question of holding together, but of states coming together. And as a viable, credible, working federal entity, India is divided into 28 states. And the rules of the game of one state do not apply to the rules of this game in the other state. The Constitution of India was very clear. The 7th schedule of our Constitution divides governance architecture into 3 lists. List 1, which entirely belongs to the union government, which is Delhi, union government headquarters being Delhi. Second, those which belong entirely in the domain of states. I say this because education and health, for instance, is entirely in the domain of states. And the third category, called a concurrent category, in which both the union and the states have equal rights. But if the central parliament has legislated, that trumps any legislation that the states may enact. Now, therefore, the complexities of the policy making is how does one harmonize a uniformity of approach of diverse states. If we look at the northeastern states of India, they have the entire cultural ecosystem, which is vastly different than if you look to North India of the Himalayan states, or for instance, if you go to the southern parts of India. So I think that one of the very important lessons, Lucy, which was learned during the pandemic, is looking at the federal entity. How does one have a unified, cohesive action which within the confines of the autonomy of states is able to put together a cohesive action? I give you a few examples. One example was the frequency with which the Prime Minister engaged with the chief ministers and governors of each state. The frequency with which the public distribution system had one common uniform policy, one nation, one card, the direct benefit transfers to the direct bank accounts of the beneficiaries in terms of banking and other things. So I think that the important lesson which we learned is how to work successfully in a viable, working, but competitive federal democracy. And the issue of federalism and center-state relations is one of the liveliest issue on which the last word is yet to be said. In fact, I myself have extensively written on it. My next book in the next 2 months is devoted to the issues of public finance, finance commission, center-state relations, and addresses the complexities of a federal entity. And I think that since you, Lucy, have an experience of the what happens in South Africa, you realize what a viable federal entity is. We have Australia, we have Brazil, you have the United States of America. So I think that the federal model in this country and the working federal model in the country adds to the challenges, but also adds to the opportunities instead of each state learning and emulating from the best example. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A last question for Kim Heungchong before we open up to the audience. Dr. Singh talked about the potential conflicts and resolution that needs to happen at different state levels of legislation. But in the previous example that you talked about, it sounded also that there were various challenges in terms of certain policy regimes around economic policy, competition policy, potential implications for relations with a large investor like America, given the dual nationality of the investor involved. How do you see those kinds of complexities developing going forward? Because obviously there are certain issues that need to be addressed in terms of protecting gig workers' rights, but that is not the only consideration which requires a balance of considerations.
So one of the main problem is that we are now all talking about the workers' rights in platform companies, but I think that is the kind of the two sides of the coin. We need to talk about the taxation problem, how to tax the digital platform companies, and so if you were talking about the welfare system, then there is two types of welfare system, like the contributory, social insurance, and also tax-based system as well. And if you think of the tax-based, so two types of the protection schemes, regimes should be harmonized and fully supported in both directions. And also, but the problem is that the government is all the government of all the states, all the countries in the world has failed to renovate their tax collection systems to the new environment of this kind of digital system. And so that's the reason why that is now the digital tax is now BEPS in OECD are also talking about this kind of issues. So government should have a kind of the bullet and the money to support the new types of the workers and that's protection, social protection, and then so it means that we need to think of very creatively and very audaciously, approaching this system. So we need to collect more money from the digital system, and also we need to keep the principle of the national treatment between the domestic local platform companies and also the foreign companies. It's mainly American companies. And also the competition policy principle should be applied to all of these kind of the platform systems, which very easily be violated. For instance, the Google in-and-out system was very hot topic, has been hot topic in Korea, and Google continuously complaining that Google in-and-out the payment system is has been banned. Banned last year in Korea. The National Assembly approved the new legislation form, and then Google is complaining. It's harsh. So all of this kind of system is related to the violation of the competition policy. So I want to say that we need, if we want to think about the new types of workers, those protection system and welfare system, we need to approach all of this kind of system in not just in the limited areas, but also in the whole systems of the economy. Okay, right, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure Google Pay being banned in Korea had nothing to do with the fact that Samsung Pay is a competing and very viable competitor in that space. I'm now going to open to the floor. If you'd like to pose a question to the panel, please raise your hand. There should be a roving mic somewhere around. If not, I have one here for you. And then if you'd like to pose a question, please state your name and designation and then who you'd like to direct the question to, but the floor is now open. Or are we all suffering from food coma? No? No takers? We clearly answered all the questions. Well done, you all. If there, yeah?
Why not? Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm Prerna, and I run a primary research firm. And it is because of that reason that we actually hire a lot of part-time workers, many of whom have a very basic degree, and it's part-time work, but we try and give them as many days of work as possible, right? So, how do you think this ecosystem will evolve, right? We can never really, to my mind, I don't think we can ever really get to a point where we can give them full-time wages and all sorts of social security that sort of, I'm not going to go as far as saying that it's going to defeat the very purpose of the gig economy, but the gig economy in a very big way is premised on the fact that businesses are saving on money, right? So how do you strike that balance wherein, these workers also have the flexibility of moonlighting as a shop worker, as a shopkeeper, and then working with us as data collectors, for instance, whilst still making some money on the side, and at the other end not being they're not getting exploited or extorted and all of that. So the question can be for anybody at all. I mean, yeah, thank you.
I think that is the question.
No, that's a great question. So I'm going to actually give you an answer which is very just based on what could happen in India. I mean, just using that example, since I'm assuming you. Currently, we have the workers you employ are probably eligible for, we currently have around 464 national schemes that are supposed to be providing benefits. And they're national and they're state level schemes. He will have a lot more to say about this. There are state level schemes as well. So a state like Kerala has around 900 schemes of its own. I think the first thing that needs to happen in the evolution is, remember I was talking about the breadth of the system versus the depth of what is being received. Can we think of a world where we said everyone has access? And right now this does actually exist in rural areas in India. So everyone has access to Narek. If you face any shock, you are able to go and work and earn wages for 100 to 150 days, right? There's no urban corollary for that right now, but imagine a world in which you thought about a program that responded to urban shocks like that as well, so, right? So different states are now, so if you're in an Odisha, for example, if you're facing a shock as an urban worker, you can actually access, they have a wage employment program, which is a guarantee, very similar to Narek. So that's one, which means that when you're not hiring them or you suddenly decide to lay them off, they've faced a shock and they can use some of these systems, right? So that's one. To improve the depth of that benefit though, perhaps one needs to think about what do we do with the remaining 462 programs, right? Which consume significant amount of budget. Often there's a lot of overlap. And so thinking very carefully, I think the evolution will require a policy shift to think very carefully about how you architect the system. The second thing, actually, your workers are actually currently eligible for the public distribution system. Dr. Singh talked about that. They're all eligible for the National Food Security Act. It's a universal right in India. They should have a ration card. And the third, which I think you're seeing India move towards, is the Ministry of Labour, the Social Security Code, essentially sets out a mechanism where contract workers, migrant workers, if you're hired for a platform, I think you'll know this, platforms are supposed to now put in a certain share, right? It's become co-contributory between the government and platform aggregators. And workers have access to a fund which provides core social security benefits. Imagine that not just sectorally, because right now it works in that funny way, the way things work in India where everything becomes very sectoral, but imagine that works for all informal economy workers, right? So, I mean, this is a thought experiment, but I think to answer your question, actually the building blocks of that in a country like India already exist, because you have the Aadhaar, you have the direct benefit transfer platforms. I think what's missing is two things. One, very clear regulatory outlining saying this is a core set of benefits that everyone has access to. We don't have that articulation yet. Second, I think to the point that I think we were just discussing, the tax financing versus the co-contributory. What norms do governments hold themselves to when it comes to budgeting for this? Because as we know, election cycles come and then sometimes you have lots of welfare spending and then it works cyclically. It doesn't usually work on, it doesn't work on the cycles of the economy, it sometimes works differently. So very clear norms around budgets. And the third is a data privacy law, because if you're going to start to do all of these, if you're going to use platforms, if you're going to start to create benefits, trigger benefits, if I were to say, well, if we're in a world where everyone should have a core set of benefits, you'll have to have an aggregated data platform. We right now don't have norms. They're being debated in Parliament, which actually allow for that to happen. So I think to answer your question, I actually do think that currently those workers can move between jobs. They currently have access to programs, particularly the Food Security Act provides a significant depth of benefit, but perhaps an urban corollary to a shock responsive safety net, which is what you have in rural areas in India, is perhaps required, along with a social insurance program that covers everyone, not just sectorally. I'll stop there, maybe.
Well, thank you. I think there's a pretty comprehensive answer. Complicated one too, because I'm sure you would have perplexed the questioner at the multiplicity of rules, regulations at the central level, and then of course at the state level, and then of course at the local level as you go down to urban local bodies and so on. But I think that that's one area which fits in with the basic theme of today's discussion, that can in some way that be simplified by technology acting as a genuine unification and having a code which would have a much wider application. That I think would be a very gainful use of technology to clear up the jungle, which he has very correctly pointed out, to complicate our life. Thank you.
All right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Lonzen Rugira. I'm from Rwanda. My question is, see, these schemes, to what extent do these welfare schemes able to actually address the real life needs of people in terms of the extent to which they're able to secure their dignity? So I've heard about the extent of the existence of the schemes themselves, but in terms of responding to the needs of the people, to what extent do they?
We actually just did, in fact, we did a survey, which is, I'm just going to use the Indian example, I think that's, and then others can share other data. We did a survey during the pandemic, and it actually follows, and it's representative. It's actually a group called CMIE in India. They follow workers. We had a module put in specifically on, did people receive all these schemes that we're talking about, the food benefit? Did you use the rural employment program? And what's really interesting is that the food rations, nearly 90% of households, because it's a universal program, you just heard me responding to the lady earlier, it's a universal program, you don't need to prove eligibility, almost everyone has a ration card, you can access. So we actually found in data, and it's not just us, there are other surveys that have been done by activists, think tanks, large groups, economists, everyone comes up to the same point, which is that the food program works. Narek, which is the workfare program, seems to work very well, but here's the catch, it works very well where it's implemented very well, which sounds odd, but you need to have local bodies, and I think you were mentioning this, Dr. Singh, you need to have local bodies that are able to create a roster of jobs to actually offer people. and often they're constrained. Sometimes you don't also have local bodies who are motivated. We have local village councils, either panchayats, there are all kinds of issues, and there's a lot actually that's been studied. RCTs have been done on Narega. The one thing we do know about Narega, which is quite remarkable, is that it was responsive during the pandemic. So the workers that Dr. Singh was talking about who went back to rural areas, they were using that program. You saw actually demand for that program really increase. You saw it in the data across the board, administrative data as well as survey data. So it does actually impact people. What continues to flail a bit in India is while we have the ecosystem to trigger cash transfers, because of the fact that most of these programs require you to prove eligibility in one way or the other, the universe of the people who actually receive the benefit tends to be small. So what we found in the data is that while food rations reached most people, cash transfers reached the people who were in the database for programs, because India used pre-existing schemes to provide the benefits. If you were in the database, you received the benefits, but there were lots of people who are not. And I think this goes back to that point we were making, which is perhaps thinking of social registries, provided you have data regulatory frameworks in place, which can protect the data that's collected, to trigger cash transfers. That seems to be a challenge. But to answer your question, there's a lot of data and a lot of studies that show that these programs do reach people. The question, though, is if these three reach a lot of people, what about the remaining 400? And there, it's an open question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, please.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. I work with Uber's public policy team. Shrayana, my question is to you. Going back to what you said earlier on about creating alternatives even in urban areas, which offer some semblance of safety in times of shock, right? So I just wanted to understand what you think of platforms itself having the potential to do so. Because during the pandemic, right, we actually saw at least Uber was deeply affected by the pandemic. The mobility business pretty much came to a standstill, but you saw food delivery platforms, logistic platforms, and even professional services for homes really picking up, right? So do you see potential for platforms to actually fill that gap in urban areas? I know that itself is a gap that we saw people who were working in formal jobs who lost their jobs during the pandemic and were delivering for food aggregator platforms. That in itself shows that there needs some sort of support that needs to be lent in urban areas. But I think that platforms can offer some sort of a viable alternative in times of shock and precarity. So I just wanted to get some sense that is there something that we could do with the government? Is it something that we could sort of be a part of if there was, say, a unified urban livelihood generation program, anything like that? Yeah.
Well, I think that it's a very relevant question. Yes, certainly in the case of, but platforms, you have to give the credit of not merely to government, but to the innovative skills of an average person. For instance, I think that we were innovative enough to have cloud kitchen. I think that, food, delivery of food, which was vital at a time of a lockdown, was delivered at your doorstep without fail. No government program was necessary to really have this kind of an initiative which came from average private citizens, and there is no substitute to that. Take, for instance, also the entire issue, the way in which the entire teaching method adapted itself to this creative, innovative hybrid mix between online teaching mostly, with some bit of tuition and offline. You take also something which I had mentioned earlier in terms of the way in which the health systems began to adapt itself. So platforms have come up spontaneously to meet needs, but I agree with you that a more coherent program would really have multiplier benefits, and that's where I think it latches on to the theme of today's subject, which is the transformative changes of technology.
Thank you very much. As the moderator, I'm not going to try and attempt to summarize the richness of this conversation, but I would like to leave us all with a couple of thoughts in terms of what this conversation has inspired. Fundamentally, I think we can all agree that whereas gig worker may be a fairly new term, the concept itself is not new. It's an age-old story that many people work 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. People have multiple side hustles. And it is really the sexiness of the digital economy that has provided us with a term, and perhaps incentivized platforms like these to start talking about the phenomenon so that we can edge the much-needed reform and modernization of legislation that will start to provide the boundaries in which a new economy like this can play. I think one of the things that came up very, very strongly is that given what the gig economy fundamentally represents, is it is a fractionalization of the workforce. And in order to address this, we need to see a much stronger unification of labor policies. And this was outlined by a number of the panelists. And fundamentally, psychological safety is at the heart of this. And psychological safety is not something unique to gig workers. It is something that is a fundamental need that has been more and more recognized in terms of creating a happy, healthy, and productive labor force, which I think we can all agree is something that every economy wants. Something I think that does need to be mentioned, however, is that while we spoke a lot about the rights of the gig worker, we did not really talk about the responsibilities. Fundamentally, what gig workers are looking for are a modicum of the protections that a formal employment provides them in terms of a social safety net and various protections in the case of a lack of continuity of work. But what this also means is that in order for the sustainability of this kind of working environment to continue, we need to start thinking about the tax obligations of these workers and how that is going to be taken into consideration, as well as data and reporting, so that we can understand better how our economies work. This was not necessarily spoken about as much, but I think it is of fundamental importance so that we reach the balance that is needed. The gig economy means for all of us. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Raisina dialogue. Thank you very much.